Welcome to your deep dive. Today we're diving headfirst into the fascinating world of economic growth.
Yeah.
You sent over some seriously thought-provoking research.
We're ready to unpack it.
We're going to unpack it together and uncover those secrets to long-term prosperity.
That's right. And we're going to be exploring how something called economic institutions can really make or break a nation's success. So get ready to rethink some common assumptions about why countries are rich or poor.
Yeah, this research isn't just about crunching numbers.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the forces that shape the world's economies, like on a grand scale.
Yeah.
And you might be surprised to learn that it's not all about geography or culture, which is what we often hear.
Right. And that's one of the most interesting things about this research is that it really challenges those very often cited reasons for economic disparities. So we always hear that, oh, those countries are poor because of geography. They're too hot. They have too many diseases. Or their culture is, they're just not entrepreneurial. What this research does is it really pushes back against that. And it points to something called economic institutions, which basically are like the rules of the game.
Yeah.
So it influences the incentives that people face and the opportunities that are available to them as the real drivers of long-term growth.
Okay, so I get it. Economic institutions, that can sound kind of technical.
Yeah.
But think of it like this. Imagine two teams playing basketball.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
One team's playing on a standard court. Clear rules, they got a referee, everything's great. The other team, well, their court is like sloped. The hoops are different heights.
What?
And there's no referees to enforce any rules.
Oh, man.
So which team do you think is set up for success?
That's a no-brainer, right? You got to have a level playing field.
Exactly.
Clear rules. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so obvious. And that's exactly what this research emphasizes. The importance of a fair and predictable economic playing field if you want to have long-term prosperity.
That's such a good analogy. And to illustrate this point even further, the paper dives into a really, I think, compelling case study, North and South Korea.
Yeah, now this is where it gets really interesting. You have two nations that are practically identical in terms of their culture, their history, even their geography, right? They share a border.
Right.
Yet you see South Korea blossoming into this economic powerhouse. And in North Korea, well, let's just say it faces, its own set of challenges. And again, they started from very similar starting points.
So it's mind-boggling to think about how two nations, seemingly cut from the same cloth, can have such drastically different economic destinies.
And that's exactly what this research highlights, is just how powerful economic systems and economic institutions can be. So in the case of South Korea, they embrace a market-oriented approach. They open up to trade, they invest in education. You look at North Korea, and they have a very different system. It's very centrally controlled, very, very centralized planning, and the state controls a lot of the economy. And this difference in economic institutions has really shaped their trajectories in really, really profound ways.
It really throws those old arguments about geography or cultural work ethic out the window, doesn't it?
It really does. It
Yeah.
really, really challenges those assumptions.
Yeah.
But it gets even more fascinating because the research also tackles something called the reversal of fortune.
Okay, tell me more about this reversal of fortune. That sounds like we're talking about a movie, like an economic thriller.
You could say that. It's this idea that historically you had certain regions that were really thriving. They were centers of urbanization. They had really high population density. This was where it was at. But fast forward to today, and many of those once prosperous areas are actually lagging behind.
Yeah, it's like that friend who peaked in high school.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes past glory doesn't guarantee future success. I guess the same goes for nations as well.
Yeah.
So how does this reversal of fortune challenge, I guess, the conventional thinking about economic growth?
So the research uses historical data on urbanization and population density to really kind of turn the traditional narrative on its head. So the traditional narrative is, these places are urbanizing, they're becoming more prosperous. This is a sign of things to come. But this research suggests that in many cases, those once thriving regions often became locked into systems. They became locked into institutions that made it very difficult for them to adapt to change, right, to compete in a changing world.
So they got complacent.
In a way, yes, they got complacent. They got stuck.
Their systems got too rigid.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay, so what led to these very different economic trajectories? Well, the research points to a significant factor: European colonialism.
That's right. And this is something that we still see the legacy of today. Colonialism's impact extends far beyond the history books, and it continues to shape the economic landscape that we see today, and this research digs into why that is.
Right. We often hear about, like, the negative impacts of colonialism, but this research kind of goes deeper, right?
Yeah.
Exploring how different colonial approaches actually shaped these contrasting economic paths that we still see around the world.
Exactly. And, it wasn't all the same, right? There
Right.
were different flavors of colonialism. And I guess in some colonies, European powers kind of went in and said, all right, we're just going to extract all the resources. We're going to set up these systems to benefit ourselves. And sadly, that continues to hinder a lot of economic development in those regions even today. But then in other areas, they actually, they invested in education, they invested in infrastructure, and those places tend to have, a bit more favorable long-term outcomes.
Yeah.
And it just highlights how those initial institutional choices can really reverberate for centuries.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that the legacy of colonialism isn't just like historical events. It's about those really sticky, enduring impacts of those early institutional choices that were made. But colonialism aside, the research also points to another, I think, really crucial factor influencing economic institutions, and that's power dynamics.
Yeah, and this is really key. So when we're talking about power dynamics, we're talking about who have power in a society, right?
Right.
Both official power, like the government, but also unofficial power, like, maybe wealthy landowners or corporations. And this research digs into how those power dynamics determine what kind of economic institutions take root in a society.
So it's not always a level playing field, right? Like those in power can kind of tilt the scales in their favor.
Unfortunately not. It's about who gets to write the rules, right? And often those who get to write the rules don't necessarily write them in a way that benefits everyone.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that saying, like, those who make the rules don't need to follow them or something like that.
Right, exactly.
But then history is also full of instances where those power dynamics shifted,
Oh, yeah.
which led to some, I think, really fascinating economic transformations.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thinking about, like, for example, like the fall of feudalism in Europe.
Okay.
It didn't unfold uniformly across the continent.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's a great example. In some parts of Europe, you see feudalism kind of crumble.
Yeah.
It paves the way for these new economic systems to emerge. But then in other parts of Europe, feudalism actually tightens its grip, right?
Yeah, and even in the face of like really intense upheaval, like we're talking about the Black Death, right?
Yeah.
That devastating plague in the 14th century. And still, it's like feudalism held on in some places.
It's amazing. Yeah, it makes you wonder why such different outcomes.
Yeah.
Right? Under seemingly similar circumstances.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what this research explores. So they use the Black Death as a kind of a lens
Okay.
to examine how the balance of power between, the lords, the nobility,
Right.
and the peasants, how did that play out in different places? And ultimately, how did that lead to these different economic institutions emerging?
It's a grim period in history, but it's such a powerful illustration of how these like crises, they can either really reinforce existing power structures,
Right.
or they can create these opportunities for change. And it seems like the Black Death, as tragic as it was, really was like this catalyst
Yeah.
for reshaping economic institutions in at least some parts of Europe.
In some places, yeah.
It's fascinating how those power dynamics played out, not just in these like grand events like the fall of feudalism, but also in, I don't know, I guess more subtle ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the research, it highlights how even something as, I don't know, seemingly technical as the development of banking systems
Yeah.
is really deeply intertwined with these power dynamics.
Yeah, you might think, oh, banking.
Yeah, it's just like,
But that's just technical stuff. Right?
yeah, like who cares?
But no, I mean, think about it.
So you're telling me that even banking regulations are a product of political maneuvering?
Absolutely, yeah. They're products of political decisions.
Tell me more about this. I'm very interested.
All right, so the research compares the development of banking systems in 19th century Mexico and the United States.
Okay.
And it's really a tale of two paths, right?
Okay.
So you have the U.S., and in the U.S. at this time, there was this very strong emphasis on individual liberty, right?
Okay.
Limited government intervention in the economy. And banking kind of flourished in that environment. You had a lot of competition, a lot of innovation in the banking sector.
So the banking system in the U.S. was kind of like this like vibrant marketplace, right?
Exactly.
Lots of players, lots of opportunities for growth and innovation.
Yeah, it was very decentralized.
Okay, interesting. What about Mexico?
Mexico took a very different path.
Yeah.
So in Mexico, you had a much more centralized control of the banking sector. The government played a very heavy-handed role in regulating banking, and they tended to favor a select few kind of elite interests.
Ah,
And
okay.
this really stifled competition.
Yeah.
It limited opportunities for a lot of people to participate in the economy, and you didn't see that same kind of dynamism and growth in the Mexican banking sector.
It's so fascinating how two nations that are geographically close, right? They're neighbors, but they embarked on these just completely different banking journeys.
Yeah,
And it all circles back to those power dynamics, right?
exactly.
It's crazy how even these like seemingly mundane parts of like how an economy works, like you said, banking regulations,
Yep.
are shaped by all this like behind the scenes action, these power dynamics.
All connected.
But it's not just banking. This research also takes us into the world of agriculture. It reveals how these same power dynamics can influence policies that are, at least on the surface, designed to actually support farmers.
Yeah, and that's something that we hear a lot about, right?
Right.
Agricultural subsidies, price controls. Oh, we need to help the farmers, right?
Because they're the backbone of the.
Exactly. They feed us.
Yeah.
We need to take care of them. And I think a lot of that is well-intentioned,
Right.
but this research challenges us to think a little bit deeper about those policies and to think about, do they always work as intended?
So it's not always just about, helping those hardworking farmers put food on the table.
Well, it can be more complicated than that, right? Because oftentimes there are winners and losers from these policies. And the research uses a bunch of examples, but one that they talk about is price controls and marketing boards in Africa. And again, on the surface, these were presented as a way to help farmers. We're going to stabilize prices. We're going to make sure farmers have a guaranteed market for their crops. But what often ended up happening was that these policies ended up hurting the very people they were supposed to be helping. They distorted markets, they created all these inefficiencies, and sometimes even led to, more powerful actors within the agricultural system actually benefiting at the expense of small-scale farmers.
It's that whole, like, a road to hell is paved with good intentions kind of thing.
Exactly. And again, it's rarely as simple as, good versus bad.
Right.
Because intentions matter.
Right.
But we also have to look at the actual effects of policies. And you're saying this goes back to those power dynamics that we keep coming back to. It always comes back to power. Because, those policies, while maybe they were well-intentioned, they were often driven by the political calculations of those in power, right? So if you're a government and you're more concerned with, say, keeping urban consumers happy, because that's where most of the votes are, or if you're concerned about, maintaining your own grip on power, you might implement agricultural policies that are more about those political goals than about the actual well-being of farmers.
It's just fascinating and, I don't know, a bit disheartening to see how often, like, political expediency kind of, like, wins out over, I don't know, like, sound economic policy.
Yeah.
Even when it comes to something that's so essential, like agriculture. And
It's fundamental.
yeah.
We all got to eat.
But this deep dive isn't just about, like, uncovering these, like, uncomfortable truths. It's about really trying to understand, like, these historical forces that have shaped the world we live in today and ultimately use that knowledge to, I don't know, hopefully inform a better future.
Right. Learn from those mistakes.
Yeah, learn from the past. Speaking of the past, the research also takes us on this journey back to, like, early modern Europe.
Yeah.
So, think like 1500s, 1600s, that kind of era,
Sure.
which was this time of just, like, massive change.
Yeah, a lot of stuff happening.
The rise of global trade, exploration, colonialism we already talked about.
Right.
And the research really zooms in on this period because you saw these different European nations kind of adopt very different strategies for how to navigate this new world, this new economic landscape.
Yeah. It's like they were all playing this, like, giant game of Risk or something, but it was real life.
Yeah.
And the stakes were high.
Yeah, for sure.
And what's so interesting is that you see these different approaches having this really lasting impact on their economic trajectories. And the research highlights two pairs of nations in particular. You've got England and the Netherlands on one hand,
Okay.
and then you've got Spain and Portugal on the other.
Okay.
So it's like we're setting up a little bit of a competition here, right? To
Yeah.
see, like, which approach is going to win out.
So it's like a tale of two strategies, one kind of leading to this, like, economic dominance,
Right.
and the other one to, I guess, relative decline. So what were the key differences between like how these two, I guess, camps approach things?
So England and the Netherlands, they really embraced this more, I guess you could say, decentralized, merchant-driven model of trade and economic development.
Okay, so they empowered the merchants, the traders.
Exactly, yeah. Let the merchants do their thing, encourage competition, foster innovation. And this really led to greater wealth creation. You see these economies really starting to take off. You see new industries emerging. Spain and Portugal, they opted for a more centralized, crown-controlled approach. So it was much more about, extracting wealth from their colonies, bringing it back to the mother country. And while they certainly enriched themselves in the short term, it really stifled that kind of entrepreneurial spirit that you saw in their northern counterparts.
Yeah, and it's just amazing to me how those early choices, made centuries ago, continue to have this ripple effect on economic development even today.
Yeah, I mean, it just shows you how sticky institutions can be. But our journey through economic history doesn't end there, because this research also delves into the emergence of something that we, living in a democracy kind of take for granted today, right? It's not that hard.
Democracy, we just assume, oh, democracy, yeah, of course.
It's the way to go.
But its emergence was not a given. It was a product of, I don't know, I guess, power struggles, strategic concessions by those in power, and often the threat of social unrest kind of bubbling up.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It wasn't like some benevolent ruler just woke up one day and said, you know what, I think we should have democracy now.
Yeah, or that it was like inevitable, right?
It was a struggle, it was messy. And this research emphasizes that it was really a product of social and political pressure.
So a testament to the power of like collective action to reshape institutions.
Absolutely, yeah. And they use a bunch of examples, but one that they really dig into is Britain's journey towards democracy.
Okay.
So they go all the way back to, when voting rights were very limited, only certain men could vote.
Right.
And then they trace it forward through the expansion of suffrage.
Mhm.
Eventually women get the right to vote.
And it's just this long, winding road.
It was a process.
It really was.
And their point is that these changes didn't happen in isolation. They were driven by the demands of citizens
Mhm.
who were becoming increasingly empowered, right?
It's a good reminder, I think, that progress is rarely linear.
Yeah.
Like we look back and it seems like, oh, it was this steady march.
Right. It always goes in one direction.
Yeah, but in reality, it's messy. It's contested, full of detours, setbacks.
And sometimes you take 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Exactly. But those struggles, I think they're so important. Those demands for a voice, for a seat at the table, to have a say in how you're governed. It's really shaped the world that we live in today.
Yeah. And it's also important to recognize that this expansion of political rights that we see with the rise of democracy, it often went hand in hand with changes in economic institutions, right? So as you have more and more people who are able to participate in the political process, who are able to voice their opinions, who are able to hold their leaders accountable, governments become more likely to adopt policies that benefit a wider swath of society, not just the elites who always held power in the past.
It's like that saying, a rising tide lifts all boats.
Exactly.
But in this case, it was the rising tide of democracy that helped lift more boats in the, I guess, the economic harbor.
This research has taken us on such a journey.
I know, right?
From like the legacy of colonialism to the power dynamics that shape everything from banking to farming to the transformative power of democracy.
It really is all connected. It really is. And I think what's clear is that understanding these historical forces and the institutions they've shaped is really, I think, essential if we want to understand why some nations prosper and others, unfortunately, continue to struggle.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it also highlights the importance of not just accepting economic outcomes as inevitable, right? We need to be willing to ask those tough questions about why things are the way they are, to challenge assumptions, and to remember that institutions, these things that we're talking about, they're not set in stone. They're shaped by human choices.
Yeah, it's not like the weather.
Exactly. We have agency. We have the power to reshape these institutions, to make them more just, more equitable, and hopefully create a more prosperous future for everyone.
So what can you do with all this newfound knowledge?
Yeah, right.
Keep asking those questions, the tough ones. Challenge those assumptions. And remember that we have the power to change things. It's not predetermined.
We're not just along for the ride. We can steer the ship.
Exactly.